My name is Sarah Running Bear, and I am a woman caught between two worlds, the daughter of a white social worker from Minneapolis and a Lakota father from Pine Ridge Reservation who died when I was 7 years old. In February 1973, at the age of 22, I made a decision that would transform me from a confused college dropout searching for identity into one of the FBI's most wanted Native American activists. I joined the occupation of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, alongside members of the American Indian movement, standing on the same ground where my great-great-grandmother had witnessed the massacre of Bigfoot's band in 1890. What began as a protest against corrupt tribal government became a 71-day siege that would change my understanding of what it meant to be Native American in modern America, while making me a target of government surveillance and persecution that continues to this day. Growing up mixed race in the 1960s meant living with constant questions about where I belonged and who I really was. My mother, Janet Morrison, was a well-meaning white liberal who worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and genuinely believed she was helping Native communities through social programs and educational initiatives. But she had married my father, Thomas Running Bear, during a brief period when he was attending college in Minneapolis on a government scholarship, far from the reservation life that had shaped his identity and values. Sarah, you need to understand that you have advantages that full-blood Indians don't have, my mother would tell me when I expressed frustration about not fitting in with either white or Native communities. You can succeed in the white world while also honoring your father's heritage. You don't have to choose between them. You can be a bridge between two cultures and help both sides understand each other better. But the reality of being mixed race in the early 1970s was far more complicated than my mother's optimistic vision suggested. At school, white classmates saw me as different and exotic, while the few Native students viewed me with suspicion as someone who was too privileged and too connected to white society to understand real Native experiences. My father's death in a car accident when I was 7 had severed my connection to his family and culture, leaving me with fragments of Lakota language and tradition that felt authentic but incomplete. The awakening to the realities of Native American life in contemporary America began during my sophomore year at the University of Minnesota, when I took a course on Indigenous Studies that introduced me to the history of genocide, forced assimilation, and ongoing colonialism that characterized the relationship between the United States government and tribal nations. The readings about boarding schools, land theft, and cultural destruction helped me understand that my father's struggles with alcoholism and early death were not personal failings, but symptoms of collective trauma that affected entire Native communities. The professor, Dr. Winona LaDuke, was an Anishinaabe activist who challenged students to move beyond academic study of Native issues toward active engagement with contemporary struggles for sovereignty and justice. Knowledge without action is complicity with oppression, she would say during lectures that combined scholarly analysis with passionate advocacy. If you understand the history of what has been done to Indigenous peoples, then you have a responsibility to support our efforts to protect what remains of our cultures and our lands. My first direct involvement with Native activism came through the Minneapolis chapter of the American Indian Movement, where I volunteered to help with legal advocacy for urban Indians who face discrimination in housing, employment, and interactions with law enforcement. The work introduced me to Native people who were politicized, organized, and determined to fight for their rights rather than simply accepting the marginalized status that American society had assigned to Indigenous peoples. Sister, you got to decide whether you're going to be Indian or you're going to be white, said Maria Crow Dog, a Lakota woman who became my mentor and guide into the world of Native activism. Can't be both when the government is trying to destroy everything Indian about us. Your mother raised you to think you could have it both ways, but that's a luxury that mixed bloods can't afford when our people are under attack. The political awakening that transformed my understanding of my identity and my responsibilities was accelerated by the Trail of Broken Treaties in 1972, when hundreds of Native activists traveled to Washington, D.C. to present demands for treaty rights and tribal sovereignty to the federal government. The occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs building that followed became a defining moment for the modern Native rights movement, demonstrating that Indigenous peoples were no longer willing to accept paternalistic government policies without resistance. The aftermath of the Trail of Broken Treaties included increased FBI surveillance and harassment of AIM leaders and supporters, creating an atmosphere of tension and paranoia that made clear the government viewed Native activism as a serious threat to established political and economic interests. My involvement with the Minneapolis AIM chapter brought me to the attention of federal agents who began monitoring my activities, following my movements, and questioning my associates about my political beliefs and plans. "Sarah, you need to understand that you're being watched now," warned Dennis Banks, one of AIM's co-founders, during a meeting in early 1973. "The FBI considers us a domestic terrorist organization, and anyone who supports our work is automatically suspect. They're going to try to disrupt our families, our jobs, our relationships, anything they can do to make the cost of activism too high for people to bear." The call to join the occupation of Wounded Knee came in late February 1973, when AIM leaders and traditional Lakota elders decided to take control of the historic village to protest the corrupt administration of Tribal Chairman Dick Wilson and to demand federal recognition of treaty rights that had been ignored for over a century. The symbolism of occupying Wounded Knee, the site of the 1890 massacre that had marked the end of armed Native resistance to U.S. expansion, was powerful and intentional. "We're going back to Wounded Knee to make a stand for our people and our treaty rights," announced Russell Means during the meeting where the occupation was planned. "This is where our ancestors died fighting for their way of life. This is where we're going to show the world that Native people are still here, still fighting, still refusing to disappear like the government wants us to." Before you continue this powerful journey of identity, resistance, and survival with us, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories about the individuals who risked everything to fight for justice and discovered their true selves through struggle against overwhelming odds. The decision to join the occupation was both impulsive and inevitable, representing the culmination of months of growing political consciousness and the desire to finally choose a side in the struggle between Native sovereignty and government control. My mother's pleas for me to stay out of dangerous radical activities were overwhelmed by my need to connect with my father's people and my heritage in ways that went beyond academic study or cultural appreciation. The journey to Wounded Knee in early March 1973 was itself a transformative experience, as caravan after caravan of Native activists from across the country converged on the small village on Pine Ridge Reservation. The diversity of the participants, urban Indians, reservation residents, traditional elders, young militants, and supporters from various tribal nations, demonstrated that the occupation represented something larger than a local protest or tribal dispute. The first sight of Wounded Knee Village was both moving and sobering, as I realized I was standing on ground that held the bones of my ancestors and the memories of genocidal violence that had shaped the relationship between Native peoples and the United States government. The small church, the trading post, and the scattered houses seemed almost insignificant compared to the historical weight of the location and the political significance of what we were attempting to accomplish. "Welcome to the independent Oglala Nation," announced Carter Camp, as new arrivals were oriented to the occupation. "This is no longer United States territory. This is Indian land under Indian control, governed by traditional Lakota law and protected by people who are willing to die for the right to be free on our own homeland." The declaration was both inspiring and terrifying, as I realized I had crossed a line from sympathizer to participant in what the government would certainly consider an act of armed rebellion. The reality of life inside the occupation zone was far different from what I had expected based on romantic notions about Native resistance and traditional culture. The 71-day siege that followed our takeover of Wounded Knee involved constant danger from FBI snipers and federal marshals who surrounded the village, sporadic gunfire that kept everyone in a state of hypervigilance, and the practical challenges of feeding, housing, and organizing several hundred activists under siege conditions. The leadership structure that emerged during the occupation reflected the complex dynamics between different factions within the Native rights movement, as AIM militants worked alongside traditional elders to create a form of governance that honored both ancient Lakota traditions and modern political realities. The daily meetings where decisions were made about strategy, resource allocation, and negotiations with federal authorities provided me with an education in indigenous democracy that no university course could have offered. "Sister Sarah, you're learning what it really means to be Lakota," observed Ellen Movescamp, an elder who had become one of my teachers during the occupation. "It's not about the blood quantum that the government uses to decide who's Indian enough. It's about being willing to sacrifice for the people, to put the community's needs ahead of your own comfort, to stand up for what's right even when it's dangerous. The spiritual dimension of the occupation was as important as the political aspects, as traditional ceremonies, songs, and prayers were conducted daily to maintain the participants' connection to ancestral teachings and to seek guidance for the difficult decisions we faced. The sweat lodges, pipe ceremonies, and traditional feasts helped create a sense of community and purpose that sustained people through the fear and hardship of living under siege. My role during the occupation evolved from observer to active participant, as I took on responsibilities for communications, logistics, and security that demonstrated my commitment to the cause, while also deepening my understanding of the skills and knowledge required for effective resistance. The work was dangerous and exhausting, but it also provided the sense of purpose and belonging that I had been seeking throughout my young adult life. The media attention that surrounded the occupation was both beneficial and problematic, as television coverage and newspaper articles brought national awareness to Native issues, while often distorting the political motivations and spiritual significance of what was happening at Wounded Knee. The presence of sympathetic journalists and documentarians allowed participants to share their perspectives directly, but it also increased the risk of surveillance and infiltration by government agents. Every reporter who comes in here could be working for the FBI, warned Security Coordinator Stan Holder during one of our briefings about media relations. We need the publicity to build support for our cause, but we also need to protect our operational security and the safety of our people. Trust no one completely, and assume that everything you say might be reported to federal authorities. The romantic relationship that developed between me and Joseph Crow Feather, a young Lakota man who served as one of the occupation's military leaders, provided both personal fulfillment and additional complications as we navigated the challenges of building intimacy while living under siege conditions. Joseph's traditional upbringing and his commitment to Lakota cultural practices helped deepen my connection to my father's heritage while also challenging my assumptions about gender roles and family relationships within indigenous communities.
Sarah, you're learning to be Indian in the middle of a war, Joseph told me during one of our conversations about identity and belonging. That's not how it's supposed to happen, but it's how it's happening for our generation.
We don't have the luxury of growing up slowly in traditional ways. We have to become who we're supposed to be while we're fighting for the right to exist. The escalation of tensions between the occupiers and federal authorities reached its peak during several firefights that resulted in casualties on both sides and demonstrated the government's willingness to use deadly force against Native protesters. The death of Frank Clearwater, a Cherokee activist who was killed by a federal sniper, marked a turning point that made clear the occupation could end in massacre if negotiations didn't produce a peaceful resolution. The psychological pressure of living under siege while being demonized in the mainstream media and hunted by federal agents was intense and sometimes overwhelming. The constant threat of violence, combined with poor living conditions and uncertainty about the future, tested everyone's commitment to the cause, while also forging bonds of solidarity that would last for decades. We're all going to be changed by this experience, reflected Leonard Crow Dog during one of the traditional ceremonies that helped maintain morale during the most difficult periods of the siege. Some of us might not survive, and those who do will never be the same people we were when we came here. But our sacrifice will mean something if it helps our children grow up free on their own land. The negotiations that eventually ended the occupation were complex and unsatisfying, as federal authorities made promises about investigating tribal government corruption and honoring treaty rights that would later prove to be largely empty. But the agreement that allowed most participants to leave Wounded Knee without being arrested also represented a tactical victory for the Native rights movement, demonstrating that organized resistance could force the government to negotiate rather than simply imposing its will through violence. The end of the occupation in May 1973 was both triumphant and heartbreaking, as participants celebrated their survival and their success in bringing national attention to Native issues, while also recognizing that the underlying problems that had motivated the protest remained unresolved. The friendships and political connections formed during the siege would continue to shape the Native rights movement for years to come, but the immediate aftermath also brought increased government repression and surveillance. My departure from Wounded Knee marked the beginning of a new phase of activism and persecution, as I returned to Minneapolis with a transformed understanding of my identity and my responsibilities as a Native person, but also with the knowledge that I was now considered a dangerous subversive by federal law enforcement agencies. The FBI surveillance that had begun before Wounded Knee intensified dramatically, affecting every aspect of my life and forcing me to live with constant awareness that I was being watched, followed, and investigated. Sarah Running Bear, you are now on the FBI's domestic terrorist watch list, announced Agent Robert Williams when he approached me at my apartment just weeks after returning from the occupation. Your participation in the illegal occupation of federal property and your association with known AIM militants makes you a person of interest in ongoing investigations of Native American extremist activities. We strongly advise you to cooperate with our investigations and distance yourself from radical organizations before your situation becomes even more serious. The threat was both explicit and ominous, making clear that my involvement with Wounded Knee had marked me as a permanent target of government surveillance and harassment that would affect my ability to find employment, maintain relationships, and live a normal life in American society. The years that followed my participation in the Wounded Knee occupation were marked by constant harassment from federal agents who seemed determined to make my life so difficult that I would either abandon my activism or provide information about other Native rights leaders. The surveillance was comprehensive and intrusive, affecting my ability to find work, maintain relationships, and live without fear of arrest or persecution for my political beliefs and associations. The FBI's counterintelligence program, known as COINTELPRO, had been officially discontinued in 1971, but the tactics used against Native activists like me suggested that similar operations continued under different names and with different oversight. My phone was tapped, my mail was intercepted, my friends and family members were questioned about my activities, and potential employers were warned about my radical associations in ways that made it nearly impossible to find stable employment. Miss Running Bear, we understand you're having difficulty finding work, Agent Williams said during one of his periodic visits to remind me of my precarious situation. These problems could disappear very quickly if you were willing to provide information about AIM activities and leadership. We're not asking you to betray your friends. We just want to know about illegal activities and plans for future violence. The offer to become an informant was both tempting and repugnant, representing a choice between personal security and political integrity that forced me to confront the real costs of my commitment to Native rights. The financial pressure was intense, as my inability to find steady work had left me dependent on temporary jobs and the generosity of friends who were themselves struggling with similar forms of government harassment. The relationship with Joseph Crowfeather continued, despite the geographical separation and the security concerns that made communication difficult and dangerous. Our love had been forged in the crucible of shared struggle, but maintaining it required constant vigilance and creativity as we tried to build intimacy while living under surveillance that could be used to target either of us for additional persecution. Sarah, they're trying to isolate us from each other and from our community, Joseph said during one of our careful phone conversations. That's how they destroy movements, by making the personal cost of resistance too high for people to bear. We have to find ways to stay connected and support each other without giving them ammunition to use against us. The support network that sustained me during the most difficult years of persecution came primarily from other Native activists who understood the challenges of living as targets of government surveillance while trying to maintain their commitment to Indigenous rights and sovereignty. The informal community of AIM supporters provided emotional support, practical assistance, and security advice that helped me navigate the dangers of post-Wounded Knee activism. The legal harassment escalated when I was arrested on trumped-up charges related to an alleged weapons violation that federal prosecutors claimed was connected to my AIM activities. The case was clearly designed to pressure me into providing information about other activists rather than to punish any actual criminal behavior, but it also demonstrated the government's willingness to use the judicial system as a weapon against political dissidents. Sarah, this case against you is complete fabrication, explained attorney William Kunstler, who had volunteered to represent AIM activists pro bono. The evidence is manufactured, the witnesses are paid informants, and the whole prosecution is designed to force you to choose between prison and betraying your community. We're going to fight it, but you need to understand that they're willing to destroy your life to get information about other people. The trial that followed was a political circus that revealed the extent to which federal authorities had infiltrated the Native rights movement and were willing to violate constitutional rights to suppress Indigenous activism. The government's case relied heavily on testimony from informants whose credibility was questionable and evidence that had been obtained through illegal surveillance. but the political climate made it difficult to receive a fair hearing from judges and juries who viewed Native activists as domestic terrorists. The acquittal that eventually resulted from the trial was both a personal victory and a Pyrrhic success, as the legal costs, emotional stress, and public exposure had taken a severe toll on my health and my relationships. The message from federal authorities was clear. Even if they couldn't convict me of crimes, they could make my life so difficult that other potential activists would think twice before challenging government policies toward Native peoples. The marriage to Joseph Crow Feather in 1976 was conducted according to traditional Lakota customs on Pine Ridge Reservation, representing both our personal commitment to each other and our shared dedication to preserving indigenous culture and fighting for treaty rights. The ceremony was attended by many veterans of the Wounded Knee occupation, creating a reunion that celebrated survival and continued resistance despite years of government persecution. Today, we celebrate not just the union of Sarah and Joseph, said Leonard Crow Dog, who conducted the traditional ceremony, but the continuation of our people's struggle for freedom and the hope that our children will grow up in a world where being Indian is a source of strength rather than a target for oppression. The children we raised together, 2 daughters who inherited both their parents' political consciousness and their grandparents' cultural traditions, grew up understanding that their identity as Native people carried both privileges and responsibilities that connected them to struggles for justice that extended far beyond their personal lives. The evolution of the Native rights movement during the 1980s and 1990s brought new challenges and opportunities as the focus shifted from dramatic confrontations to legal advocacy, cultural preservation, and economic development that could provide sustainable foundations for tribal sovereignty. My own work evolved toward education and cultural programming that helped young Native people develop pride in their heritage while preparing them to navigate both traditional and contemporary worlds. What we learned at Wounded Knee was that resistance takes many forms. I often tell young people who ask about my experiences during the occupation. Sometimes it means putting your body on the line and facing down government agents with guns, but sometimes it means teaching children their native language, or fighting for treaty rights in court, or simply refusing to let them convince you that being Indian is something to be ashamed of. The declassification of FBI documents in later years revealed the extent to which federal authorities had illegally surveilled, harassed, and attempted to destroy the lives of Native activists who had participated in Wounded Knee and other protests. The documentation confirmed what we had always suspected, that the government had viewed indigenous rights activism as a threat serious enough to justify violations of constitutional rights and the rule of law. Looking back on the decision to join the occupation of Wounded Knee, I understand that it was both the most dangerous and the most important choice I ever made. The experience connected me to my father's heritage in ways that no amount of academic study or cultural appreciation could have accomplished, while also teaching me that being Native American in the modern world required active resistance to forces that sought to erase indigenous identity and sovereignty. The FBI may have hunted me for decades after Wounded Knee, but they never succeeded in breaking my spirit or my commitment to the cause that had given my life meaning and purpose. The surveillance, harassment, and legal persecution were the price I paid for standing up for treaty rights and indigenous sovereignty, but they were also proof that the government took our movement seriously enough to fear its potential impact. The occupation of Wounded Knee lasted only 71 days, but its impact on my life and on the broader Native rights movement continues to this day. The experience taught me that identity is not just about blood quantum or cultural knowledge, but about the choices you make when your people's survival is at stake. The mixed-race woman who went to Wounded Knee searching for her identity found it through struggle, sacrifice, and solidarity with people who welcomed her as family despite her complicated background. The legacy of Wounded Knee lives on in the continued fight for indigenous rights, environmental protection, and cultural preservation that engages new generations of Native activists who face different challenges but the same fundamental choice between accommodation and resistance. The FBI may have tried to destroy us, but we survived, and our children and grandchildren carry forward the vision of indigenous freedom that motivated our sacrifice and our struggle.